Okay, hi everyone. I'd like to invite you just for 10 seconds to think about one of the world's biggest problems. So, in the last 10 seconds, you may have thought about one of the problems on this list, or perhaps even something more specific to your knowledge and experiences. The fact is, this list of problems are endless. And here are just some kind of large categories which make up many complicated and systemic problems in our society, many of which we know need solutions. And we've probably all ended up in a debate, read up on, watched documentaries, and raised awareness in some way or contributed towards something we really care about, and something that we view as an issue that absolutely must be tackled. I'd say we are all micro disruptors in some way, even just a small conversation or making someone see a different view or going against the grain of the current context you are in. However, I think one of the biggest problems we face with all these problems is taking action, really becoming a disruptor. You know, how many of us have entered countless debates and meetings where we sit around and talk about the problem without coming up with solutions? And we know that finding the solutions can be the hardest part, because if what we have been doing isn't working, how do we come up with something completely new? Or how do we link concepts and ideas that no one has thought of yet? And this is the basis behind the talk today. I'm going to speak to you about some of the science behind how we might disrupt, how we might go against the grain. So let's begin by thinking about what is disruptive thinking? What does it mean to be a disruptor? To be disruptive in general, as an adjective, is to cause disruption or unrest. And when we think about being disruptive in a business context, it means causing major change, as in a market. But really, it's thinking that challenges the traditional way of doing things. And the reason that it's disruptive is it brings about innovation that completely changes the way a company or industry behaves. And ideally, when we think about some of the world's biggest problems, even perhaps how society behaves. It means to cause change. But interestingly, even the word itself can have some negative connotations. If we look at some words that are linked to disruption, we can see things such as interrupt, interfere, disturb, be a hindrance. You know, I find words in the English language associated with disruption are not always that positive. But I think when the goal of disruption is positive, it can be one of the most important actions that we can take. And in fact, we need people brave enough to do this. You know, we need people like many of the speakers at this festival who are tackling issues on the pandemic, equality, inclusion, race, science, cancer research, social media, cybersecurity, and so much more. No action is really taken on our problems without disruptors. So I guess the real question is, how do people do it? And I think we can look a bit into the scientific basis of disruption to start to pick apart and understand this. So, as you might imagine, it is just as hard to cause disruption as it has been to begin studying what makes a change maker. So, in general, disruption is not a single event, and it doesn't just happen instantly. So you can think about the time I gave you to think of one of the world's biggest problems. I gave you about 10 seconds, and you're retrieving something that you probably already know from your memory, something that you've heard is a big problem in society or something that is important to you. And you probably would have retrieved this from your memory within milliseconds, and you might have even thought of more than one. But the thing with disruption is it's a much more complex cognition. It involves lots of events and decisions. So we need to start breaking this down. I'd say firstly, you need to have an idea. You need to spot an opportunity. And this could be something that you notice yourself or something that you're alerted to that needs to change. And usually there is a problem at the heart of this, something that really requires change or could be done in a better way. And your creative idea stems from all that you know and how you connect information with your current environment and social context. Secondly, with the idea, you must explore how this might work. So you must action the ideas and take them forward into this unknown territory. Because if it's not unknown, then you're not really disrupting. And thirdly, you must adapt and mediate, not just your actions, but yourself. And this is where things like your emotions, self-reflection, and social input can come in to help. So we're going to think about each of these areas in more detail throughout the rest of the presentation. So let's start to think about how we come up with ideas and some of the current science behind it. Sorry, in true style of a disruption talk, we're getting some disruption from people's microphones. So can we please just make sure you are muted? So to come up with a disruptive idea, it needs to be, obviously novel and unique, and it needs to go against the normal way of doing things. And I think kind of how we've come up with unique ideas has mainly been studied as creativity, which involves both the collection of the experiences and knowledge that you already have and a way of thinking that starts to connect them in a non-linear fashion. So, for example, most of you will have heard, or may not, so I'll introduce it to you, that the prefrontal cortex is an area at the front of our brain, which is involved in what we call higher order thinking. So if I gave you a hard task that required attention and effort, say a kind of maths problem or a puzzle, a network sometimes called the central executive network or the multiple demand network is found to be engaged. And these are kind of networks and areas in the brain that are really involved in attention and cognitive control that allows us to work towards a particular goal. And we understand quite a lot about these regions. We understand a lot about the subnetworks within them that are specialized to certain tasks and how we form higher reasoning and judgment because of them. And this is because it is really common in an MRI scanner or when you are doing an EEG experiment to give subjects a puzzle or a problem-solving task. However, it is really hard often to force a creative idea using this network. For example, if I told you right now to come up with just one thing you could do or one solution to the big problem that you might have thought about at the beginning, how creative would your response be? For example, say I thought about the climate crisis. In a split second, I could think of a number of things I could do. I could cut my meat consumption, I could walk instead of driving, I could turn my lights off. But these aren't very unique ideas. I didn't create these ideas. It's probably things that other people have told me or I've heard of before, so I'm just retrieving it from my memory. And if you gave me 5 minutes to sit and force out a creative idea, I might be able to get into this kind of concentrated flow state where I'm coming up with multiple ideas and even things that start to seem a little bit unique. But I would say the chances of these ideas being truly disruptive are probably quite small. And why is this? The likelihood is that I'm not giving my brain the chance to reach its creative capability. So in contrast with this incredibly concentrated, task-active force state, what was discovered a few years ago was that when people were asked to do absolutely nothing in the MRI scanner and just let their mind wander, activity in the brain is just as high, but in a different network of regions. And this was coined the default mode network. And as you can see, it's kind of composed of the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus. In many ways, it's thought to be engaged when people are less focused on the outside world. And originally, it was thought to represent a kind of task negative or a complete inactive state. However, it has since been shown to be important for internally created thoughts, future planning, goal setting, and conceptual thinking. In particular, in relation to how we come up with ideas, science since has been exploring this network and relating it to our ability to connect information and concepts in our long-term memory that otherwise may have had weaker links, and how this helps us come up with unique and novel ideas. More and more theories are emerging that tell us that optimal ideas and unique solutions come from both a disengagement and re-engagement of our task active state. And what I mean by this in very basic terms is that the science suggests you have to let your mind wander and switch off this really forced cognitive control to perhaps come up with the most creative solutions. And I think we could probably all see this in our everyday lives. How many people have been really stuck on a problem only to have the solution come to them in the shower, in their sleep, during meditation, during exercise, essentially when they're not trying to find the solution. So should we just all relax all the time to be disruptors? Perhaps not quite. So while the default mode network is implicated in creative and perhaps coming up with disruptive ideas, ideas are useless without evaluation and action. So counterintuitively to what I've just told you, the same theories and work that show the default mode network is implicating creativity also show an overlap and engagement of the multiple demand network, this kind of cognitive control, this attention. Because the areas of our brain that switch on when we are working hard to figure something out are also needed. In a broad sense, in order to take action, our ideas on our actions, we need to kind of undergo a multitude of decisions. And with each decision, we have a choice. Do we exploit something that we already know? Or do we explore new angles? So exploiting is where people do the same thing that they have done before. And this is kind of linked to reward circuits in our brain. Whereas exploring is trying something new, which may even have a lower or an unknown chance of reward. So we can see why exploration might be particularly important in being a disruptor. And studies have actually looked at exploitation versus exploration in entrepreneurs versus managers. So entrepreneurs in this sample are the disruptors, and they can kind of help us understand a little bit about the cognitive mechanisms that may be required for disruptive thinking. So Loureiro, Martinez and colleagues compared managers to entrepreneurs in a functional MRI bandit task. And a bandit task is basically a gambling task. So it involves 4 slot machines and participants can only learn about the payoff of a slot through playing the game, exploring them, seeing which one is most likely to give them like a good result for them to win. And the participants' behavior was modeled with a computational model, which essentially reflects their hidden beliefs about the current value of each of the 4 slot machines. And these kind of models and experiments basically enable researchers to uncover the strategies that people use in their decision making. So to go back to this kind of exploration versus exploitation, they can see whether a choice is made based on the hidden belief of what is most likely to be correct, so that kind of exploiting, or making a choice that actually has a lower expected chance of reward or an unknown chance of reward. And that's seen as this kind of exploratory choice. And so in the same experiment, researchers did show that when you exploit something you already know to cause a reward, this engages kind of memory systems and areas of the brain that are involved in anticipating that reward. However, in contrast, exploration engages the attentional control areas in the brain. So the results showed that entrepreneurs performed better in the task and had increased activity in the brain network associated with exploratory behavior and this kind of cognitive control and increased attention. So these findings start to contribute an understanding of the neural basis of what we call inter-individual differences in decision making. And the optimal performance in decision making may require sometimes more cognitive control and attention. Yet it still leaves many questions about when it is best to exploit and when it is best to explore, particularly in everyday life, because we can imagine scenarios where in a particular context, to perform better, you probably do need to exploit processes that you already know that work. But to be disruptive, we perhaps need to explore more. So the question becomes, when do you exploit, when do you explore, and how do we, as humans who want to be disruptors, know what to do when? And how do we engage our disruptive thinking? And I'd say this is what I'm trying to figure out with my research. So I've shown you so far that there's evidence and theories that coming up with creative ideas and actioning them requires actually quite different processes in the brain, and that both a disengagement and a re-engagement of our cognitive control is needed to be creative. And in fact, the study I mentioned earlier, what they did start to show, and subsequent studies that they've done have shown, is that it's perhaps not what you employ more, whether you exploit or explore more, but actually how good you are at switching between the states, depending on the task that you're addressing. And it's clear that being creative and exploring ideas requires perhaps stepping outside the way we usually think and exploit information into what I would call more of an optimal learning state, which we can see our brains all have the ability to do. And in fact, we do this from a very, very young age. Exploring and exploration as a behavior basically enables us to learn how to do anything in the first place. So I would say that it's not that having disruptive ideas is only reserved for the select few. I think we all have them, or at least the ability to have them. But one of the issues is, once we become adults, what's stopping us engaging in so much exploration is perhaps we are becoming too linear and too structured in our way of thinking and the processes that we apply to a problem. So how can we let our mind run free, but direct enough attention that we are truly engaging in exploration and disruption? I'd say one key thing to understanding this could lie in one of the biggest barriers to disruption, and that's uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the biggest things that stops people disrupting or becoming entrepreneurs. Despite the kind of time and resources side of things, it's this fear of the unknown. And the reason that we might lead more into exploiting the methods we know to work, especially when we are limited for time or resources, is because we're more certain of the outcome. Our brains really like predicting what's coming next and dislikes not knowing. Uncertainty is actually so unpopular that people prefer the certainty of pain to an unknown outcome. So there was some really interesting research at UCL that they found participants were more stressed when they were being told they had a small chance of receiving a painful electric shock than when they knew with 100% certainty that they would be subjected to this pain. And I think we can see this in many elements of our life, whether it's waiting for the outcome of a job interview or waiting to know how long lockdown will last. Sometimes sitting with uncertainty is so much more unbearable than facing bad news or a bad outcome itself. But I was having a conversation with an entrepreneurial disruptor the other day who's founded kind of many businesses in the plant-based food industry, who I asked the question, because I love asking every entrepreneur to try and get their perspective, you know, how do you deal with the uncertainty? And he said, I hate certainty. I find it boring. Not knowing what comes next is what excites me. So could it be that to be a disruptor means somehow loving the thing that our brain really doesn't want us to do? And I think when you think this way, you can start to see why entrepreneurs and disruptors are sometimes termed risk takers. They dare to do what perhaps anxiety tells us not to do, which is tread in that unknown territory. Which kind of leads me to the final point and step, if you want to say, in being a disruptor, which is actually mediating and adapting your relationship with uncertainty. So while past research has shown the kind of networks in the brain that can support these different ways of thinking, particularly how we can be creative and come up with an idea, or how we can explore alternative decisions, less is known about how we make this choice and how we mediate the effects. But I think some early findings might start to point towards the impact the emotions, attitude, and support that people use can help them navigate this uncertainty. So, in fact, the same researchers who looked at the exploration and exploitation studies I showed, they did go further to start to discuss how emotions such as fear and anxiety prevent us switching into this exploratory state. And we know this about anxiety. It causes avoidance to the things that we don't know because they seem too risky. We kind of form an attachment to the known and a fear of the unknown. However, other research that I've shown here on the screen have shown that entrepreneurs can have the same kind of emotional attachment to ventures as parents do to their children. And if you know entrepreneurs, if you are one yourself, you often know that people even say that they're like, it's like a child to me. And what's really interesting is they also relate, these authors related their kind of results in this kind of bonding to self-confidence. So they found that parents and entrepreneurs who have these kind of different bonding styles, but parents and entrepreneurs with low self-confidence show signs of a kind of anxious bonding style to both their children or their ventures. And when they put them in an MRI scanner, they found that this kind of anxious bonding reflected strong activations in the amygdala, which is known to mediate anxiety and fear. Meaning there is a relationship between how entrepreneurs make effective decisions based on their own self-confidence and these kind of attachment styles and tendencies to feel anxious, regulated by areas in the brain known to kind of regulate fear, could perhaps be a very, very kind of complicated relationship that leads towards how much people engage in this exploratory behavior and kind of how fearful or not they are of the unknown. And on the flip side, they also showed that this kind of attachment activates the reward system in the brain, and it can actually suppress negative emotions if this attachment is formed in a positive way, which to me starts to suggest that even perhaps while it can, be linked with anxiety, attachment to our ideas or as an entrepreneur to their venture could actually alleviate the negative emotions that can be felt and really be the key to how they navigate the uncertainty and lead disruption is they are just so attached to their idea, so passionate about it that they just drive it forward. And, you know, they showed in this that, you know, the attachment to the venture or the idea can lead to slightly less rational judgments. But perhaps they're just not overthinking things too much and just being fueled by the fact that they care so much. And I think in addition to what we can understand about attachment styles and emotions and ourselves and how that mediates our relationship with uncertainty, you know, we can also think that we don't have to do it alone. We can explore the science behind how others alleviate the anxiety. And one of the key contributors to entrepreneurial success is the social support, the mentors and the advisors that they have. And in the context of uncertainty, we know that experience from others can fill the gaps where we don't know or we can't predict what might happen. Now, this hasn't really been heavily researched yet in entrepreneurship literature or in understanding disruption. But we do, in the kind of neuroscience world, have tools that can test people's social cognition and how much weight they place on others. And I think this would be really interesting in the future to test how much social support and advice can mediate disruptors' response to uncertainty. You know, for example, do you go against the grain and ignore those feelings, telling you it can't be done, or other people telling you it can't be done? Or does disruptive success come from a balance of considering other people's opinions too? So to summarize what I've just gone through, the kind of key steps to being a disruptor come with ideation, to kind of come up with these more creative, innovative ideas, and perhaps considering that you need to allow the cognitive control network to just have a break. But then actioning this is where that network comes into play, to explore new ways of doing things. And I think being open to learning, being curious, less fearful of failure is important, although I've put that's easier said than done. But really this kind of adapting and mediating, the self-awareness, working to understand yourself, using your emotions to drive your passion in a positive way, and building a social network that is supportive and knowledgeable can really help alleviate this uncertainty. So the next steps for my research, I've presented some of the mechanisms in the brain that underlie how we come up with disruptive ideas. But overall, at the moment, it's not clear why or how some people find it easier than others. I've shown some ideas for how emotions, self-reflection processes, and the kind of impact of others might interact with this. But the next steps for my PhD will be to work out how it is that disruptive people make the choice to think in that way, and the mechanisms that support them navigate the uncertainty. So I'd say what's kind of left to understand is this kind of interaction between the core cognitive processing that I've spoken about, the environment and the context that people are in, their kind of personality and their attitudes, and then also how we kind of mediate our decisions with this emotional self-reflection and social control. And I think, you know, there's kind of key differences perhaps in how disruptors and entrepreneurs make decisions, but what we really need to understand is what level this is at. And with this, I think, comes the ability to develop much more kind of personalized training that we can give to people, and environments that we can create that best support particular individuals in how they can be more disruptive. I'd just like to show a few insights from my research so far. So this is kind of unpublished, it's just the initial analysis that I've done, but one of the trends that I can see in some online data that I collected was that particularly expert entrepreneurs are scoring higher in personality traits such as neuroticism and openness, and lower in conscientiousness. And I think this is interesting because this kind of passion, emotionally driven openness might actually be the key to disruptive thinking, because it allows a state that optimal learning can happen in. And low conscientiousness means not taking a too thought out or planned approach. And in some ways, this kind of makes me think of children, and how curious they are. You know, they're not often scared of failure, but just keep trying to master something. And, you know, it's still to be proven, but perhaps we need to start to embrace that kind of inner childlike learning more. And just to demonstrate this, I'm just going to show you a really interesting video of something that's called the Marshmallow Challenge.
Improvement pill here. An interesting experiment called the Marshmallow Challenge was conducted by a design consultant named Peter Skillman. He worked with 4 unique teams: a group of recent business degree graduates, a group of lawyers, a group of CEOs who ran their own companies, and a group of kindergartners. He provided each of the teams with the following tools: 20 sticks of dry spaghetti, 1 yard of tape, 1 yard of string, and a single marshmallow. Now, the rules for this challenge were really simple. Each team had 20 minutes to try and make the tallest structure possible with the marshmallow on top, and the structure had to be able to stand on its own. Now, this challenge may seem rather simple and straightforward, but the results might actually shock you. See, the teams that did the worst were actually the recent business degree graduates. Following them in third place were the lawyers. In second place were the CEOs, and in first place with the tallest structures were the kindergartners. Wait, how is this possible? Because it's without a doubt that a group of CEOs, people who run multi-million-dollar businesses, should be more competent than a group of kindergartners, kids who are still learning their ABCs and simple math. How in the world did the kindergartners win? Well, here's how the experiment usually went for most of these groups. The first couple of minutes were usually spent getting organized, figuring out who was in charge, figuring out who would do what. Then the groups would spend a decent amount of time arguing about which method was the best. They would hold votes and vote for the best idea. And then finally, after all of that planning, they put together a prototype and finished right on time with just seconds to spare. But more often than not, they would fail. Most of these prototypes, most of their structures were unable to stand on their own. The only group that didn't follow this sort of protocol were the kindergartners. They didn't plan, they didn't argue about who was in charge, they didn't vote for the best idea, they just jumped right into it, making prototype after prototype, failing and failing, but constantly trying again. And by the time the 20 minutes were up, they had tried on average 5 different structures as compared to the average of just one structure the other groups made. The kindergartners won because they tried and failed more than any other group. So, Improvement Pill, what's the point of this? Why are you telling us a story about kindergartners and marshmallows? Well, this experiment actually gives us a lot of insight on how we should approach certain problems in our own lives. You know, I see this happening all of the time. So many of us, when confronted with new obstacles and challenges, get obsessed with planning and figuring out the best way to solve it. Some of us think, oh, I just need to read another book to make sure I know exactly what to do. Some of us think, I just need to go back to college and get a better degree so that I'm more qualified. Some of us think, oh, I should just wait and wait for the perfect time when all of the stars align, then I'll take a shot and it should work out. Oftentimes we spend way too much time thinking and planning and not enough time doing. But as you can see from this simple little experiment, sometimes it doesn't matter how competent you are. It doesn't matter if you are a CEO or a lawyer or have a fancy business degree, because you can be beat by a group of kids who can't even tie their own shoelaces simply because they try and fail more than you do. Now, don't get me wrong, learning is incredibly important as it exposes us to new ways of thinking. But oftentimes, we become paralyzed with information. Remember, it's important to learn, but it's equally, if not more so important, to take action and test out what you've learned to see whether or not it will work for you. And it's okay to try and fail, because then you'll know what doesn't work and you'll be able to get further the next time you give it a shot. And trust me, you'll be surprised by just how far you can get and how much you can accomplish by just giving things a shot. That's the lesson of the Marshmallow Challenge. This episode was brought to
Oh, we don't need to watch that again. So I hope the video really demonstrated why this exploratory way of thinking and embracing learning and failure is really required to kind of be more creative and disruptive. And now, when we think of facing the world's biggest problems, as adults, we are at an advantage to kindergartners. So we know so much more. And I think what's key is utilising this knowledge in that flexible way. And interestingly, also as part of this online study, I asked entrepreneurs, both experts and novice and non-entrepreneurs, to self-report on competencies that they perceive themselves to be good at. Everyone in the sample was over the age of 18. And much like the kindergartners that we saw, entrepreneurs report being good at this kind of ideation, coming up with different ideas, resourcing, which is kind of really actually actioning those things, and growth, which is a concept that related to a lot of questions around adapting when things fail, trying something new, kind of being resilient. But also, much like kindergartners, communication and planning is not perceived by them to be one of their greatest skills. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not important to be an entrepreneurial disruptor, but it doesn't differentiate those who are the kind of expert entrepreneurs compared to those who haven't started a business. And I'm really kind of looking forward to continuing my research and discovering more about what it takes to drive this innovation, how we can encourage people to embrace this kind of creative and exploratory state, whilst using all the knowledge and experiences that they have gained throughout their life and education. So we're not a bunch of children running around being disruptive, but we are disruptive adults that can use the skills and knowledge that we have to create a positive change. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was fascinating. I have a question. You spoke about it a little bit. I think I'm just like fascinated with the fact that how naturally disruptive we are as children, excuse me, and you know, how difficult it becomes as adults and what happens along the way and what sort of, obviously you've mentioned fear. Is that sort of the key to, you know, overcoming that and tapping into that childlike, fearless mode, disruptive mode? Yeah, just wondering a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's something I want to figure out is, yeah, how to help people as adults kind of tap back into this. I think, you know, one of the reasons that as adults we don't have it so much is we've spent pretty much our entire life in education being told not to be disruptive, you know, to stay in lines, to follow rules, to follow protocols and procedures. And I think it's kind of developed this quite structured way of thinking, which creates this fear, because when we want to operate outside of that structure, we really don't know how that's going to be perceived, whether we're going to get in trouble for doing it, or whether the actions we take are going to have any kind of positive outcome for us or not. So I think it, you know, that's one of the things as adults we need to consider is kind of how we've been conditioned in our past to kind of think in this perhaps more linear, structured way, and actually how that leads to this kind of fear.
Thank you. We have another question from Maria, please.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, because it was really interesting and I can't help taking notes. Well, my question is, I really recognize myself because I tend to change the job like each year, because when I know everything, it's really boring and I'm not productive anymore. And like, I'm a chief marketing officer, and I used to be a PR director. I used to be an editor-in-chief, a chief like events manager, and I'm a linguist by profession. And now I'm learning psychiatry. And people think I'm not normal, so I need to, like, my psychotherapist was always telling me that something is not like okay about this. So could you, and I'm also relocating like quite often. So now I'm in the UK. I used to live in France, in Russia, in Cyprus. And could you please tell me what's wrong with my brain? Is it different in fMRI or?
Well, so actually we're starting the MRI part of the study in kind of January, February next year. So I'm looking forward to getting entrepreneurs inside the MRI scanner. I would say there's absolutely nothing wrong with your brain. It's just I think perhaps you've mastered what it is that I want to eventually be able to teach people, which is this ability to kind of step outside of the known, of the certainty. And I think that's really brilliant, like to be able to embrace uncertainty and just keep trying new things. Personally, for all of us, like that would be the key to being really successful, because you don't just operate within the structure that you know. So I guess I can't tell you perhaps the answer to your question, but yeah, I think it's great that you keep trying new things.
I'm sorry, just a comment, but there is another part of this. So there are people who just, live all their life being a great scientist and digging in the same subject. And like many other people, like myself, like many other scholars, I feel like I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. So don't you think that inviting people to try without any knowledge, without like I don't think you're going like to preach, just to try without basing themselves on any other like background. Don't you think that those people might miss something really important, which is like mastered only when you're profoundly in one field?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such an important point. It's kind of what I was getting at towards the end, is that I think rather than like kindergarteners or like children, where you are operating without the kind of knowledge and experience and background behind you, I think the key to kind of being a disruptor or being entrepreneurial is the fact that you do have that experience and knowledge base behind you. So you do have kind of everything to draw upon. And kind of what I want to see is, okay, so based on all those experiences and knowledge that you have, how do you kind of connect concepts in a new way and kind of step outside of the way that, say as myself as a research scientist, the way the current, your discipline works in. So if you think of, if people are familiar with like research science, the fact that traditionally you kind of submit papers to journals who publish those papers, and kind of they won't really let you publish it anywhere else, and they make a lot of money from it and you as a scientist make nothing. But there's kind of a real drive towards open science at the moment, which means a lot of researchers publish their own papers online and they own the intellectual property to that and things like that. So that's a kind of an example of how you can work within like a discipline and a system. So as a scientist, but people can start to take actions that just start to disrupt that and like step outside, but they still need to be a scientist. They still need to have the the kind of background and the knowledge and experience. So yeah, totally, like such a good point. And thank you for like allowing me to clarify that I don't mean just go and like go into a discipline you know nothing about and explore like a child.
So we've got a few more questions. We'll try and answer them all. Faye has raised her hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Emily. That was a great talk. I'm the Wellcome Trust PhD Programs Manager, and I'm really keen to see the students, go more into entrepreneurship and turn their great PhDs into business ventures. So I'm just wondering, and it's kind of like a funny question based on all that you've presented, do you think it's possible to train them to be entrepreneurs, right? Add more training to their training, which is part of the problem? Or yeah, what's your thought? Do you think that just by educating them about what might be holding them back isn't itself enough, or are there exercises that we could be doing and maybe working on with you that will sort of give them that liberation they might need?
So interestingly, the Entrepreneurship Institute is starting to run a PhD program. And I wrote it was just a blog post a little while back, which was kind of why PhD students need to develop their entrepreneurial skills. And actually, I think there's a lot of overlapping skills with being a PhD student and being a researcher and being an entrepreneur, in that you are quite disruptive in a way. You find a niche, you find something that hasn't been addressed before. But I think the approach that a PhD student takes is so different. It's all about like, I need to read the whole background literature. I'm going to plan out absolutely everything before I even take any action at all. So I think like PhD students are a really, really good place to like give some training, because you can tailor it at the thing that is lacking, which I would say is kind of taking that action and being, like you say, creating a business venture like from your research. And like, I personally am quite passionate about the fact that there isn't enough support and there isn't enough training for PhD students to know how to kind of use their research in an impactful way. But I would say that I think it's totally doable. And one of the things is even like connecting with the Entrepreneurship Institute, and for PhD students to be around people who are starting a business, they can start to see how it's done and learn kind of through other people.
I completely agree. I think that exposure is key, right? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there's an interesting question in the chat box. Interested in differences from Timothy. Interested in differences, similarities between entrepreneurs and gamblers, and also to what extent disruptive thinking is associated with mental health issues.
Okay, so let's go for the first bit. So the link between entrepreneurs and gamblers. So I guess this stems on the kind of risk-taking element and kind of the thrill-seeking element. I don't actually know myself if there are kind of links between gamblers and entrepreneurs. I think that would be an interesting study to do. But I think and I know there is a lot of research in the psychology of entrepreneurship and the mental health aspect of it. So in some ways, there are studies that show that entrepreneurs actually have they kind of report quite high like life satisfaction, and they report kind of feeling very fulfilled in their work and things like that, or probably because they're doing things that they are passionate about. But then on the flip side, we know that there's a lot of issues with things like burnout and mental fatigue in entrepreneurs. And I think a lot of this comes from, the fact that they have this passion, this drive to kind of keep wanting to work at it, that it's like knowing when to hit the brakes. And, I often do try and kind of like tell people that, I've lost Angelica, but that, the bit I kind of presented in terms of creativity and the fact that you kind of need this downtime, I really kind of feel like rest is really important to kind of perform your best, be creative, make the most efficient decisions. That I hope this kind of work can lead into helping that kind of mental health aspect for entrepreneurs in the future. Because if we can understand a little bit more about how we disrupt and come up with those ideas, but also perhaps the negative impact that can have on our mental health, then we can provide better support. But yeah, as I kind of said towards the end, like a lot of this stuff is unknown. I started the PhD about 2.5 years ago, and the literature to base it on has been very limited. So it's kind of just like creating and evolving as I go.
Thank you, Emily. There's another question from Fagan, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. you touched on how education has been one of the fundamental factors that has hindered disruptive thinking. My question is, do you think schools and teachers, what do you think schools and teachers could then do to help reverse this effect and instead encourage disruptive thinking among young adults?
That's such a good question. I think it would be incredibly hard, as we know, to kind of change the whole education system. And obviously, I think that it's come about in a way that they needed a kind of benchmark way to like assess maths children. And this is why we have these kind of exam boards and this way of testing, which, you know, I understand the reasons for, but as I said, yeah, I think causes a slight issue in the way that we learn to behave. I think just encouraging even, you know, more entrepreneurial activities from a young age, giving more creative challenges to people in school. There's, off the top of my head, I can't remember the kind of like name of them, but there's been some really cool experiments where they do go into schools and they do kind of like give children, I think there's something called like the £1 challenge or something, and they do it a lot in American schools. So they kind of give them £1 and tell them they've got like however many weeks.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, and like, you know, they've got to like come back and try and make as much, and children can be so creative in the things that they come up with, that I do think things like that could really encourage people to just kind of step outside the box a bit and not just think, I need to learn all this kind of like content for a GCSE exam and do the exam and memorize everything, and that's the key to success. Because when we kind of enter the work world and when we become adults, we realize that just remembering stuff is suddenly not enough to perform. But yeah, it's a really interesting question and needs some really disruptive thinkers to be able to know kind of how we change this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question from Jessie, please.
Hello, thank you, Emily, for a fantastic talk. Really enjoyed that. I found it really interesting. I think my question's mostly around when you were talking about personality types. Mm-hmm. So you may not have an exact answer about this, but I found myself having a question, and it was around maybe two different questions in one, really. One is, so far, have you noticed anything around the kind of person who's maybe a perfectionist on a project versus the kind of person who somebody is, let's just get something done because that's better than nothing, but maybe it's not always quite, you know what I mean, that kind of perfectionist mentality, and we'll keep cracking on at the same project until it's just right, versus someone who gets something done and then moves on to something else. Mm. And I guess that's possibly linked a little bit to the idea of, the stereotypical completer finisher, and whether or not that's common in entrepreneurs or not. That's my question.
Yeah, really good question. I don't know if I've got the kind of research evidence to back it up, but we do often speak about the fact that there are often like the kind of doers, and as I've kind of shown in this, like, being able to take action and explore things and maybe not spend too much time planning, I do think it is key in kind of disruption and entrepreneurship. And I think that a lot of the entrepreneurs that I see who are successful are doers. Like they literally get out there and get it done. They're willing to fail, and if they fail, then they'll learn from that and adapt and change and like pick it up again. So it is this kind of mentality of like, don't spend too much time trying to perfect everything before you actually get out there and try it out, and most importantly, see if people like it or respond to it. So I'd say for now, like I don't have the data, I don't have the kind of research to back it up, but I have a very strong feeling that, yeah, as you're saying, like you do have people who are more the doers. I would just add on the flip side that I think something that I've perhaps kind of missed out and not spoken much about is actually the impact of kind of teams and what we call like collective cognition. So I think you often do need like a driver, you need someone who's the doer, who just gets out there, but you do also need in the teams people who can take that more conscientious approach to kind of actually make sure things get done.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you.
Right, we've got quite a few more questions. There is a question from Natasha. In your research, have you read anything regarding the neuroscience of procrastination and how this ties into entrepreneurship, disruptive thinking, whether disruptive thinkers are procrastinators or not? Implications of this.
It's really interesting. I haven't, but it's just sparked something in my memory that I remember. It must be a research study. If it is, I'll try and dig it out at some point. But they I remember reading somewhere that procrastination is actually super useful to be more creative. But it's a balance, right? You don't want to procrastinate so much that you don't do anything. But kind of in procrastination, in the same way that I spoke about the default mode network and how that kind of comes up in rest, you get out of that task active state and you allow some time perhaps for your brain to make those slightly obscure connections between things. I think when you come back to a task, you can address it in a much more creative, innovative way. And I think that actually a lot of this kind of creativity is this very like inward, sometimes even overthinking things, which I do think can happen in procrastination. So it hasn't been necessarily researched as far as I know, but I think it would be something super interesting to look into.
I just posted a link to a blog written by the CEO of one of our ventures, Supernote. So for anyone who's interested to read a little bit about procrastination, there is a question, I'm just trying to find it, around have you looked into those who failed in their entrepreneurship venture? There have been many failures which usually do not get publicity. Anything on that, Emily?
So I haven't analysed it yet, but I did ask a question about failure because, as you say, it's super important not to just ask if people have started a business, but how that's gone for them. I don't know is my answer, but it is something that I am planning to look a little more into. Because I think that's a really important basis of the research too, is just understanding actually not just what makes people like want to enter into it, but then what makes people succeed. But then on the flip side, I'd say a lot of failures can also help that kind of learning iteration process. I'm sure a lot of the expert entrepreneurs, so in the sample, there are people who have over 10 years experience, have founded at least 3 businesses. I'm sure there's been some failure along the way there. So it's about, trying to decide what's a good like metric of success, I think.
We've got Jacqueline. Please go ahead with your question. Whilst we're waiting, I'll just have a quick look.
Yeah, I was just going to say the £1 challenge. It might be called like the $1 challenge because it was American. I don't know if that will help bring something up.
There is also a question: how does the self-report personality traits ocean relate to the fMRI? Any correlates?
So this hasn't been done in the MRI. We haven't done the MRI scanning yet. In general, in non-entrepreneurs, like in just when you look at a healthy population, I do think there are studies that relate personality traits to brain activity or to actually structural differences in the brain. So it's something that when I do scan my entrepreneurs, I'll definitely be looking into.
Right, I think that might be all the questions now. Before everyone goes, I'll remind you there is another event that talks about disrupting intelligence through drawing. So a little bit more about the creative sides of disruptive thinking and how to tap into that through creativity. And yeah, there's plenty more events for you to join, so make sure to have a look, and we hope to see you there. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for all your great questions.